Under the humid haze of coastal Alabama, tucked behind rows of identical sun-bleached houses and precise suburban hedges, sat the home of Clay Bennett, a man who many in the neighborhood didn't quite understand and certainly didn't attempt to. His house was older than most on the block. Built with real wood and a steel-beamed frame he reinforced himself. The backyard, in contrast to the HOA-regulated aesthetic of trimmed grass and pastel lawn chairs, looked like a metal garden of industrial dreams. Welded arcs twisted into abstract loops, raw sheets of aluminum leaned into vertical thrusts, and tall iron pillars cast jagged shadows at dusk. Some called it grotesque. Others called it fascinating. But one thing was certain. Clay didn't care what anyone called it. A welder by trade but an artist by compulsion, Clay wasn't some reclusive old man holed up in a fantasy. He had clients, exhibitions, and occasionally a gallery showing in Atlanta. But what truly mattered to him was the discipline of building things that could survive time, light, and scrutiny. His pieces weren't decorative. They were confrontational. Even the curved steel gate at the front of his property had a quiet defiance to it, as if asking anyone who approached, "Are you sure you belong here?" He had earned that defiance over decades of work, mistakes, and the slow, brutal business of learning how to be left alone. To the people around him, especially in the neighboring developments where conformity wasn't just encouraged but quietly enforced, Clay's property felt like a threat. It wasn't the noise. They barely heard it. It wasn't even the smell of scorched metal or the occasional flicker of light through his workshop window. It was that he didn't ask for permission. He didn't try to fit in. That, for people like Karen Whitmore, was an unforgivable offense. Karen, 59 years old, was the kind of woman who believed rules were what kept America from descending into chaos. She had built her world meticulously. Floral hedges cut with ruler precision, patio chairs arranged at exact angles, wind chimes chosen specifically to harmonize with the birds she overfed each morning. She wasn't a monster. She wasn't cruel for the sake of it. But control was her native language. It had helped her survive 2 marriages, 3 miscarriages, and the kind of relentless loneliness that only perfect people suffer from. Her position as neighborhood president wasn't something she sought out. It was something she earned through attrition. Others stopped showing up. Karen never did. She never missed a meeting, never forgot a due date, never failed to comment on the improper location of someone's recycling bins. When she noticed Clay's metal structure peeking over the back fence, she didn't see art. She saw non-compliance. When she saw sparks from a welding torch after dusk, she didn't see passion. She saw a safety violation. When she heard from her friend Gina that Clay had brought in a new sculpture taller than the community height limit, she saw war. The sculpture that finally shattered the fragile piece had no name at first. Clay had welded it over 2 weeks, working late into the evenings, pausing only when the air got too thick or his hands too numb. It was an 11-foot column, bent at the top into a narrow hook, from which extended a sharp mirrored disc, polished steel, warped at angles, catching the sun in slashes of light that changed hour by hour. It wasn't just beautiful. It was aggressive, imposing, reflective in the most literal sense. It shone like a beacon in the late afternoon and flared like a blade by sunset. Clay mounted it at the far edge of his yard, just within the setback limits. On the morning after installation, Karen stood at her kitchen sink, washing a single glass with circular precision, and the sun hit her window differently. A flash of silver light burned across her counter, reflected through a precise angle from Clay's sculpture. She dropped the glass. It shattered, spraying against the tile, and she stood there staring, first at the shards, then at the light crawling across her wall. Her jaw set, her spine straightened, and for the first time in years, She felt something close to indignation that didn't stem from unwashed mailboxes or unauthorized basketball hoops. That afternoon, she put on her beige linen jacket, stepped into polished flats, and walked to Clay's front gate with the air of someone who knew how this story was supposed to end. She rang the bell once. No answer. She waited, then knocked, not hard, but firm, like a tax collector who believes in their righteousness. Eventually, the door creaked open and Clay stepped out, wiping his hands on a rag stained with rust and soot. Karen didn't smile. She didn't introduce herself. She simply said, "That piece in your backyard. It needs to come down." Clay stared at her, silent before lifting one eyebrow. "Morning to you, too," he said, voice dry as summer steel. "I'm serious. It's a hazard. It's reflecting sunlight directly into my kitchen. It burned my eyes." "That's a safety issue. I checked the community handbook." "I didn't sign your handbook," Clay replied. Karen blinked. "Excuse me. I rent this property from a private owner. It's not under your jurisdiction. I checked." The way she inhaled made him think of pressure cookers. "Even if that's true, there's such a thing as being a good neighbor. That structure is excessive. You're welding out here at all hours. I've had complaints." "From who?" "That's not your concern." He leaned against the doorframe, clearly not intimidated. "Then neither is your kitchen glare mine." The conversation ended there, not because it was resolved, but because Karen realized, with something approaching horror, that she couldn't win the way she usually did, with tone, with position, with passive threats. Clay didn't blink, he didn't fold, he didn't care, and worse, he was right. The next day, a notice appeared in Clay's mailbox, unsigned, generic, printed on thin white paper. "You are in violation of Community Light Ordinance 14C. Unshielded reflective structures may be subject to immediate citation." There was no Ordinance 14C. Clay knew that because he had the foresight to read every public code applicable to his zoning the week he moved in. But someone reading that might believe it. Someone more easily shaken might remove the sculpture. Clay folded the paper, walked out to the column, and leaned it against the base with a magnet. He added a small engraved plate below it that read, "Reflection is voluntary. Blame your angle." He didn't write it for her. He wrote it for himself. In the weeks that followed, things began to shift. At first, subtly. Clay noticed someone watching from a black SUV parked at the end of the street. Too clean, too still. Then his power tripped 3 nights in a row. No clear cause. He chalked it up to coincidence until his welding torch went missing. He found it the next morning in the middle of the road, crushed. But the sculpture remained, and as summer thickened and the sun burned low across the sky, its light danced further, slicing into neighboring windows, bouncing off sedans, illuminating driveways with eerie geometry. Karen was seen walking her route with large sunglasses and a sun hat so wide it covered her shoulders. Children giggled behind her back. Teenagers began taking selfies at Clay's fence. What had started as a battle over aesthetics began to grow into something deeper, uglier, something neither of them would be able to walk away from without blood, or at least reputation, on their hands. And all the while, the sculpture stood silent, glistening, spinning faintly in the breeze, watching them both. Clay didn't expect the real blow to come through the city rather than the usual route of neighborhood bickering, but 3 weeks after Karen's doorstep confrontation, a uniformed inspector showed up at his gate, clipboard in hand and badge, prominently displayed. The man was polite, professional, and clearly uncomfortable with the situation he was walking into. He asked Clay a series of structured questions about permits, structure height, welding frequency, and potential safety hazards related to reflective materials. Clay answered everything with calm precision. The sculpture was within zoning limits. His welding was confined to daytime hours, as confirmed by his neighbor across the street. The metal used was heat-treated, non-toxic, and documented as part of his registered small business. Yet the inspector didn't leave without issuing a formal notice of evaluation and a deadline for submitting a range of technical documents, including light dispersal analyses and reflectivity ratios, terms that Clay suspected someone else had planted in the complaint. That evening, Clay did what he hadn't done in months. He sat at his desk and printed every document related to his work. He compiled material safety sheets, zoning maps, receipts for the materials, permits for small-scale industrial activity, correspondence with the property owner, and even the blueprints of the sculpture itself. By midnight, he had filled a binder thick enough to slam with an authoritative thud. He dropped it off at City Hall the next morning, slid the binder across a polished counter, and asked for a stamped receipt. No drama. No escalation. Just traceable, concrete defense, but the paper war had just begun. Karen escalated quickly. 2 days later, Clay received a certified letter, on formal community council stationery this time, asserting that his structure may violate emergency access guidelines due to its location near the easement. Clay's blood pressure didn't rise, but his attention sharpened. He paced the boundary of his property, noted the easement's exact measurements, 7 feet from the edge of the public walkway, and then pulled out a laser measurer. His sculpture sat 7 feet, 4 inches from the edge, within limits, again. Still, the threat wasn't in the details, it was in the pattern. Karen wasn't trying to win any individual battle. She was creating fatigue. She was sowing confusion through volume, trying to overwhelm him with paperwork, redirect his time, exhaust his patience. It was an old tactic, one Clay had seen before during his early contracting years when unscrupulous developers would strangle small operators with inspections and code violations. Now he was facing a lone operator, but one with zealotry on her side. The neighborhood, too, began to shift. People stopped waving when Clay passed by in his truck. A woman who once asked him about commissioning a fire pit now crossed the street with her toddler when she saw him coming. Someone spray-painted the word nuisance on the side of his mailbox, sloppily, in bright orange, and then washed it off the next morning. That inconsistency was almost worse than a real attack. It meant someone out there thought they were justified but not brave enough to own it. He found nails beneath his tires one morning, scattered in a way that wasn't natural. Another day, he came home to find all his backyard spotlights unscrewed, bulbs left lying carefully next to their housings, undamaged but removed. It wasn't vandalism. It was psychological. Pressure without fingerprints. He reported the incidents. The police wrote notes. No charges were filed. Clay responded the only way he knew how, with more structure. He called his lawyer. Not someone off a billboard, but a quiet, razor-sharp woman named Amanda Lynn, who had once been a city prosecutor before starting her own private firm. She listened, nodded once, and asked for everything. Every letter, every inspection, every measurement. When Clay handed her the binder he'd compiled, she smiled faintly and said, "You're the kind of client who makes my job enjoyable." Amanda drafted a formal letter to the council, requesting clarification on the ordinances cited. She demanded precise references, copies of complaints, and legal justification for every action taken against Clay. The tone was civil, but the subtext was unmistakable. I know the law better than you. Respond accordingly. Within a week, the community board went silent. No more citations, no more letters. Clay thought perhaps the pressure was over. Maybe Karen had realized she'd picked the wrong target. Someone with the means, the knowledge, and the will to fight back properly. But it wasn't over. It had only evolved. That Sunday, as Clay worked on a new project, a commission for a steel water feature, a sudden shadow fell across his yard. He looked up, squinting against the glare, and saw Karen standing just beyond the fence line, not on the sidewalk, but in the gravel between the fence and the road, where no one ever walked. Oh. She was wearing a wide-brimmed visor, enormous polarized sunglasses, and holding her phone as if documenting the angle of sunlight with scientific rigor. Clay didn't speak. He simply raised his phone and took a single photo of her posture, her location, and the fact that she was clearly targeting the sculpture again. She turned, saw him watching, and said loudly and slowly, "You know what this thing is doing to the neighborhood?" Clay remained silent. She stepped closer, squinting toward the sculpture. Then she took another step. That's when it happened. The angle of the late afternoon sun hit the steel disc just right, one of those rare combinations of time, tilt, and temperature. A blast of reflected light bounced off the disc, curved through a half-second of warping heat shimmer, and struck Karen full in the face. She screamed, not a theatrical yelp, but a guttural, sharp cry, and dropped her phone. Her hand clutched at her face and she staggered backward, cursing and breathing in short gasps. Clay rushed forward, not because he cared for her injury, but because someone was hurt near his property. He didn't touch her, didn't cross the fence, but he called 911 and explained that a woman had suffered what looked like a flash burn to her eyes. The operator asked if she was conscious. "Very," he said flatly. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes. Karen refused transport, insisting that she was fine, but one eye remained swollen, red, and visibly irritated. She glared at Clay as the EMTs cleaned her skin, muttering about negligence and lawsuits. The next morning, he received a call from Amanda. "She filed a claim against you," she said. "Personal injury. Says your sculpture constitutes an intentional public hazard. She's requesting damages, removal of the piece, and an injunction against further welding activity on your property." Clay exhaled. Not surprised, not shaken, just tired. Amanda continued. "We're going to need to bring in an optics specialist, a light dynamics expert." This is no longer about neighborhood tension. This is litigation. You up for it? He looked at the sculpture, still gleaming, still silent. "I built it with full awareness of physics. It's not a weapon. It's metal and light." "Good," Amanda said, "because she's coming at you like it's a loaded gun." The lawsuit was just the start. Clay knew that. What he didn't know, yet, was just how far Karen was willing to go to claim victory over something she couldn't control, and just how many people in the neighborhood were willing to stand by and watch it happen, quietly complicit in the hopes that someone else's resistance would buy them peace. Clay's initial instinct after the lawsuit filing was restraint. He had Amanda in his corner, and he trusted her, trusted the system, at least enough to let the gears turn as they were meant to. She assembled the required documents swiftly, and within a week had not only filed a response but had already scheduled an independent analysis of the sculpture's light dispersion. Clay thought perhaps this would be the climax, an ugly courtroom showdown and then peace. But he had underestimated Karen, or perhaps overestimated the boundaries of ordinary persistence. What he was dealing with wasn't litigious spite, it was obsession, and obsession didn't follow logic. It consumed it. 3 days after Amanda's counterfiling, Clay noticed unfamiliar tire marks on the gravel near his fence. Not the sweeping arcs of casual parking, but tight turns, abrupt starts, like someone had driven right up, paused for some time, and then sped away in haste. That night, when he returned from a materials run, he found the gate to his backyard swinging half open, the latch unhooked. Nothing seemed stolen or destroyed but several of his welding rods, bundled in protective tubes, had been cracked and scattered near the shed. It wasn't theft. It wasn't sabotage. It was meant to unsettle, to rattle the foundation. Amanda filed a police report and insisted Clay install motion-triggered floodlights. He added thermal sensors and a second layer of fencing around the sculpture, not because he thought it would deter Karen. She didn't strike him as the kind of person to climb fences, but because someone else might. And this wasn't just about territory anymore. It was a psychological game now, and the objective was clear. Wear him down. The following week, Clay noticed that mail from city agencies, typically slid into his box with government efficiency, began to arrive with long delays. Then one day, it didn't arrive at all. Instead, he received an official reprimand from the postmaster. An anonymous complaint had accused him of using his mailbox to store hazardous industrial documentation in violation of federal postal codes. Amanda intervened swiftly and the charge evaporated, but the message was clear. Karen had found new levers. Amanda took a more proactive stance. She filed a motion demanding all original complaints against Clay be submitted for discovery, requiring full names, timestamps, and documentary evidence. What came back was a spreadsheet of 31 separate entries. 22 of them listed the same language. Unsafe art structure endangering visual health and causing neighborhood disharmony. All were filed within a 7-day period. The names. Neighbors Clay barely knew. The Johnsons, the Riveras, even Dan Turner, who had once asked Clay for help fixing his porch railing, had apparently signed his name to the pile. Clay walked the neighborhood that weekend not to confront, but to observe. He noted the quieted eyes, the awkward glances, the way conversation stopped when he passed. Only one person met his gaze, an older man named Whit, who lived 3 houses down and rarely came out except to prune his bonsai collection. Whit simply looked at him and nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, not alliance. It was enough. Karen, meanwhile, had begun cultivating her own kind of momentum. She called for a community safety forum, announcing it via hand-delivered leaflets tucked into screen doors and mail slots. The notice was printed in serif font, with clean margins and a centered title, Maintaining a Harmonious Environment, Public Art, and Public Risk. Clay, of course, was not invited, but Amanda attended, under legal observation. She recorded the entire event. What happened wasn't exactly slander, but it came close. Karen stood at the center of a semicircle of folding chairs, gesturing with printed images of the sculpture, selectively lit, captured from angles that made it look monstrous, looming like some alien instrument of war. She described children squinting in pain, elderly residents frightened to walk their dogs, one woman even claiming she'd nearly crashed her car due to a sudden glint of sunlight across her windshield, a road nearly 2 blocks away from the sculpture's line of sight. Amanda didn't intervene. She just took notes. But Clay, when she relayed the details, felt something shift. Until now, this had all been noise, tactics, pressure. But this was the part where reputations began to rot. Not just professionally, he could withstand that, but in the subtle social fabric of the community. These people were creating a narrative of threat, and he was the villain in their quiet domestic drama. He didn't need friends among them, but being cast as a danger was another thing entirely. 2 nights later, a drone flew over his yard. Clay saw the flashing red light around 2 a.m., a quiet buzz barely above the hum of the night crickets. He stood on his porch, shirtless and barefoot, and stared it down until it hovered away. Amanda reported it to the city, but no one claimed it. Clay installed anti-drone netting along his roofline and moved his projects indoors for the time being. He adjusted the sculpture slightly, not in submission, but in technical refinement. He altered the pitch of the reflective disk by 12 degrees, making it nearly impossible for light to strike the same surface from the original complaint angles. He documented the change, submitted the engineering adjustment to Amanda, and posted a small sign near the base of the sculpture. Angle modified. Verified safe, documented under legal observation. It wasn't petty. It was precise. Every action, every adjustment, an answer to a falsehood. Every move, measured, admissible, and above reproach. But the attacks didn't stop. Clay's property taxes were suddenly re-evaluated. A surprise audit letter arrived from the state's Department of Revenue. Amanda was incredulous. "This is coordinated," she said. "No way this is coincidental." They hired a forensic CPA to go over his finances. Nothing was found, but the hours lost. The anxiety churned. It was taking its toll. Clay slept less, worked more. The metal in his hands felt heavier than it should have. And then, one afternoon, while he was in town picking up supplies, someone breached the fence. He returned to find the base of the sculpture smeared in some kind of resin, an acidic compound that had begun to etch tiny fractures into the mirrored surface. Not enough to ruin it outright, but enough to create lasting stress points. Amanda pushed for a formal investigation. This time, fingerprints were taken. A single partial print was recovered from the lid of the chemical container found discarded behind Clay's shed. It matched no one in the system. Karen, when seen later that week, wore a fresh visor, her eye nearly healed, her posture as commanding as ever. She made no direct comments, but Clay noticed her pausing at the edge of his fence line, once again just within legal limits. Watching, assessing, calculating. Amanda advised Clay to hold back, let the system work. But Clay, walking past the damaged sculpture each day, seeing the etch marks, the erosion of form, understood something Amanda didn't. There were rules, yes, but some people didn't care about the rules. They counted on others to be bound by them while they played a different game altogether. And in that realization, Clay didn't feel rage. He felt clarity, because now he knew exactly what kind of war he was fighting. And he was prepared to fight it to the end. Clay had always believed in leverage, not the crude kind of physical advantage, but the quiet, calculated kind that came from knowing the rules better than your opponent and using them without ever raising your voice. The attack on the sculpture, while not entirely unexpected, served as a turning point, not because of the damage itself, which was largely cosmetic and repairable, but because it marked a transition from harassment to direct assault. It was no longer about discomfort or neighborhood aesthetics or Karen's personal vendetta. It was now about destruction, and once someone had crossed that line, Clay knew he could no longer rely on calm responses or procedural defenses alone. He needed escalation, not in confrontation but in precision. Amanda responded swiftly. She brought in a professional forensic engineer who specialized in material stress testing and a light optics consultant who previously worked in architectural safety compliance. They arrived together, a man and a woman in their early 40s, both dressed not for field work but for courtroom testimony. Clay led them quietly into the backyard and stood back as they began their assessments. The forensic engineer ran instruments along the surface of the sculpture, measuring microfractures and noting the chemical etching patterns. The light consultant measured the angles, the height, the position of the sun, and the reflectivity of the metal. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. Their job was not to be impressed. It was to be precise. When they left, Amanda requested full written reports and notarized declarations. Within 4 days, she had them in hand. The reports were damning, not for Clay, but for the logic of the lawsuit against him. The light dispersion report showed that the reflective angle capable of causing retinal strain only occurred for a window of 37 seconds during one specific day of the year, under ideal weather conditions, and only if the observers stood within an illegally trespassing zone 3 feet inside Clay's property. The structural damage assessment confirmed the etching was caused by a corrosive industrial cleaner, unlikely to have been accidentally spilled and likely applied intentionally. In short, Clay was not the aggressor. He was the target of a coordinated effort to create liability where none naturally existed. Armed with this, Amanda filed a formal motion to dismiss the lawsuit and submitted the evidence as supporting documentation. But more than that, she also requested an inquiry into the coordinated complaint campaign, citing possible witness tampering and civil conspiracy. It was bold, and it sent a message, not just to Karen, but to anyone quietly feeding her war. The motion shook the neighborhood. Word spread, not through gossip, but through silence. People who once averted their eyes now made awkward eye contact. One woman, a middle-aged mother of 3, left an envelope at Clay's gate. Inside were copies of group emails, threaded conversations between Karen and several neighbors, some of whom had expressed reluctance about signing complaints. Karen had told them to trust her, that she'd take care of it legally, and that Clay wouldn't have the money or energy to fight back once the city got involved. It was the smoking gun Amanda didn't expect but immediately acted on. She filed an addendum to the civil conspiracy claim and requested subpoenas for the listed participants. Karen, for her part, didn't retreat. She went public, not to the media, but to the church circle she led on Wednesdays. She gave a teary-eyed speech about neighborhood safety, about the dangers of unchecked industrialization, and even made vague references to Clay's past, references that had no basis, but which played well to fear. A rumor began circulating that Clay had once been involved in a workplace fire. Another claimed he had PTSD and had snapped before in other neighborhoods. None of it was true, but truth, Clay knew, rarely mattered in closed social ecosystems. Perception did. Amanda, sensing the momentum shifting, played her ace. She called in a former law professor, now an independent mediator, and scheduled a voluntary community arbitration session, open to the public but formally overseen. Karen, confident and sure she'd win hearts, agreed. She walked into the neutral venue in pressed slacks and a blazer, clutching her binder of selective photographs and copies of the lawsuit. Clay wore his usual jeans, boots, and button-down. He brought nothing but Amanda and the truth. The session began with formal introductions, and then a review of the complaint. Karen spoke first. She was articulate, passionate, and theatrical. She described the sculpture as hostile, claimed it was visually aggressive, and insisted that Clay had made no effort to be a part of the community. She framed herself as the guardian of common good and Clay as the anomaly poisoning it. When the mediator asked for documentation, she provided photos of light glares, printed maps with alleged risk zones, and even a diagram someone had drawn of a potential fire caused by focused sunbeams. Then Amanda stood, requested permission to present counter-evidence, and calmly laid out the light report, the trespass data, the forensics, and the community emails. She showed how the claims lacked foundation, how the glare incidents were nearly impossible unless one deliberately stood in the path of reflection, and how Karen had misled others into coordinated action. The mediator listened, asked clarifying questions, and took notes. When the session ended, she offered a preliminary summary. There is no evidence of wrongdoing by Mr. Bennett under any zoning, safety, or civil ordinance currently in place, she said clearly. Furthermore, I find the coordinated nature of the complaints to be concerning." Karen sat silently, her face unreadable. The room, previously tense, fell into a kind of suspended judgment. The attendees, including many who had previously remained silent, now had to choose whether to remain loyal to an increasingly discredited cause or recalibrate their positions. A few murmured among themselves. One elderly man approached Clay afterward and simply said, "I didn't know. I should have asked you directly." But Clay wasn't interested in apologies. He wasn't looking for reconciliation. He wanted space, not approval. He returned home that evening and found something unexpected on his doorstep. A package, unmarked, anonymous. Inside was a small canister of the same corrosive agent used to attack the sculpture, along with a single slip of paper that read, "You're not done yet." "Neither are we." Clay showed it to Amanda. She froze. "They're escalating again. This isn't just about the sculpture anymore. It's you." Clay nodded slowly. "I know, but now I have everything I need to finish this. For good." And he meant it. Because from that moment on, the fight was no longer about defending what he'd built. It was about proving once and for all that the people who hide behind righteousness are sometimes the most dangerous of all. Clay knew that the arbitration session was more than just a procedural victory. It was the moment when the war changed shape. The evidence had been heard. The community had seen the truth. But the effects of fear and coordination can persist long after the facts are laid bare. He returned to a yard that felt different, even as he locked the gate behind him. The sculpture still gleamed with weighted purpose, but the air around it was heavier, tense with anticipation. The anonymous canister on his doorstep had changed everything. This was no longer a conflict confined to pages, letters, or expert testimony. It was now personal, direct, and unrestrained. Almost immediately, things escalated into the physical realm again. That night, Clay's security alarms tripped at 2 a.m. He'd gone back to working late in the shop, attempting to refocus on form, a new series of polished columns echoing the defiance of the central sculpture. When the alarms pinged, he walked outside with a loaded flashlight and a phone in hand. He saw 2 figures retreating across his yard, hacking away at the base of one of his newly cut metal sections. The light caught the angle of surgical intent. These were not neighborhood kids. These were people who knew exactly what they were doing. Clay did not chase them. He locked the gate again and called the police. Within minutes, flashing lights and officers swarmed his property. He pointed out dance patterns through the mulch and disturbed gravel that showed where the intruders had worked. Behind the scenes, Amanda had already prepared affidavits from prior experts, stating that the target damage was consistent with intentional industrial tampering. This was no vandalism. This was sabotage. While the police processed evidence and collected statements, Clay retreated to his shop and stared at the sculpture, silently acknowledging the shift. This was no longer just about a design or a neighborhood disagreement. It had become a calculated campaign, with coordinated complaints, damage to property, deployment of false documents, and now physical intrusion. The fight transcended zoning codes. It became a fight for dignity. Following the break-in, Amanda didn't just file a new incident report. She escalated their legal approach dramatically. She petitioned for a protective order against persons acting in concert to harass and damage the plaintiff's property. It would block trespass and directed interference. She demanded immediate access to surveillance footage from Karen's house and from any other private cameras within 500 feet. She subpoenaed the subpoena. She demanded logs of community email threads, liability insurance filings, and HOA minutes, even though they weren't formally HOA anymore. She requested depositions from Karen and any board members who participated in circulating complaints or organizing surveillance. It wasn't just about winning. It was about dismantling. News of the break-ins spread through the block not with triumph, but with tension. Some neighbors called Clay to express concern. A handful, more than before, offered tangible support. One offered to install a private security light. Another offered to lend spare floodlights from a barn. An older couple brought fresh-baked bread and stayed long enough to offer heartfelt condolences and an apology for not speaking sooner. Moment by moment, the silent ones were breaking ranks. But Karen remained silent. She canceled her plans for the Wednesday community circle, citing private family matters, and was not seen for days in public. During that window, something unexpected happened. Clay received an email, encrypted from a burner account. It included something he hadn't known he needed to see. Footage from a security camera 2 houses down, taken the night of the attack, showing a person wearing plain clothes but distinctive boots. Boots Clay recognized from a pair he had sold to a neighbor weeks prior. The figure slipped through the gap, stayed under the radar, tampered with his metalwork, then left without alarm. The timestamp was clear. It was undeniable. Clay forwarded it to Amanda. She responded with a single sentence. "Let's begin." Within 48 hours, his lawyer filed a motion for emergency relief citing malicious intent, trespass, and conspiracy. She requested a restraining order covering Clay's statues and tools, and also demanding that the person in the video produce the boots for evidence, under immediate court order. She named the adjacent homeowner as unverified, but her motion made clear that if the shoes were not produced and identified, the inference would be drawn in court one way or another. Clay, meanwhile, kept working on new designs, smaller pieces this time, made to look like bent pages of steel bound to their own gravity. He didn't work for show. He worked because waiting meant the lawsuit would stretch, the site would stagnate, and the fight would slowly consume him if he had nothing to show for it. He needed motion. Motion gave meaning. Motion reassured that he was not powerless. The psychological escalation began, too. A package arrived for Amanda at her office. A postcard of Clay's sculpture with the message, "Tell him we're watching." It wasn't addressed to Clay, yet everyone knew who it was meant for. The recipient, who had once presented as detached and objective, now ducked slightly at every knock on the door. She decided they would not retreat, but would respond, a posture Clay deeply respected. As the court date neared, Amanda organized a private session of media. Not mainstream press, but national art journals and specialized trade publications about sculpture, urban integration, and zoning integrity. Clay's story was becoming not just a lawsuit, it was a moment in art law. A tension between creativity and control. A man forced to defend silver and steel with nothing but integrity and expert testimony. When the protective order hearing took place, it lasted less than 2 hours in court, but reverberated far beyond. The judge examined the footage of the intrusion. He listened to Rachel Turner, the owner of the shoes, testify that she had lent them to her partner, who had gone over to Clay's yard on Karen's request to adjust the sculpture angle, based on some misreported complaint. Karen, subpoenaed, took the stand and said she had no knowledge of trespass. That's when Clay's team played the audio from the encrypted email. "Your boots were seen," it said. "I hope that was your choice." It was thin but impactful, a suggestion that someone from Karen's circle assumed wrongdoing and conspired to carry it out. The judge responded by granting a temporary restraining order on all non-essential approaches to the sculpture, requiring any approach to be logged and communicated ahead of time, which effectively cut off most covert access routes. He also ordered an expedited process for the civil conspiracy discovery. It wasn't a victory, and certainly not the end, but it was a turning point. The law recognized Clay's isolation and took steps to protect him. By the time Clay returned to his shop that evening, exhausted but resolute, a new kind of quiet filled the backyard. It wasn't peaceful. It was a breath before movement. Because now, the fight was not just legal, but moral. It was a reckoning over who would define what creativity, property, and community really meant. And Clay understood, perhaps more deeply than ever, that the second act of escalation wasn't about violence or courtrooms. It was about dismantling fear and rebuilding courage. He looked at the sculpture, its steel disc dulling under moonlight, and thought, if we don't fight people like this, what chance do the rest of us have? And he knew that whether this story ended in a settlement, a verdict, or an art exhibit, he would have etched something more lasting than metal. He would have carved out proof that when people stand for what they make, what they believe in, and what they deserve, the world has a way of noticing, even when others would rather see it forgotten. The morning of the final hearing arrived beneath a sky thick with unmoving clouds, as if the weather itself refused to pick a side. Clay didn't dress differently. Still the same dark jeans, clean work shirt, steel-toe boots laced tight, but there was something in the way he walked that had shifted. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even tense. He was deliberate, rooted, fully aware that what was about to unfold wouldn't just affect him. It would shape how far someone like Karen could go, unchecked under the mask of order and tradition. Amanda met him outside the courthouse, legal briefcase already open, hair tied tight, heels planted like nails into the concrete. She said little, only nodded, and handed him a printout. It was the last exhibit she planned to introduce, an annotated map showing the position of the sculpture, the angle of the sunlight, and the fixed location of Karen's own property. There was one detail circled in red, a spot marked Trespass Zone, the area where Karen would have had to stand to receive the alleged glare that caused her temporary eye injury. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was brittle. On one side, Karen sat, flanked by two men in beige suits, one of whom had a file an inch thick labeled Community Damages. She wore a soft blue blouse, simple earrings, and had her expression carefully molded into that of quiet injury. Her left eye, once swollen and inflamed, was now fully healed, yet covered in a lightly tinted lens, presumably for effect. Several community members were present as well, seated quietly behind her like pale shadows, unsure whether they were witnesses or bystanders. On Clay's side sat Amanda, a stack of documents aligned perfectly beside her, and a local photographer who had offered to document the case for a sculpture journal. No media frenzy, no spectacle, just the cool efficiency of a legal reckoning. The judge, a middle-aged woman with sharp features and an impatience for nonsense, called the room to order. Karen's attorney was the first to speak, presenting their narrative with an almost rehearsed cadence. The sculpture was dangerous, he said, a visual hazard, an aesthetic threat, and above all, a deliberate act of intimidation. He spoke of Karen's injury, of the children who avoided walking past Clay's property, of the mental anguish caused by the towering steel construct that loomed like a weaponized mirror. He submitted photos, some from strange angles that made the sculpture appear larger than life, and even referenced old building codes irrelevant to Clay's lot. But the key moment came when Karen took the stand. Her voice was clear, steady, and wrapped in a kind of restrained outrage. She described the light, how it had struck her eye, how she had cried out, how she had needed treatment. She sent it not to the residents, but to the property company's legal team, and blind copied Alexis. Within a week, the tone of everything changed. Karen received a cease and desist letter, private, not public, but undeniable. She began not with refutation, but with facts. The light dispersion report was submitted again, the angle evidence, the timestamps. She walked the judge through each document with precision, letting the data speak before drawing conclusions. Then she introduced the footage, grainy but clear, of the figure tampering with Clay's sculpture. She followed it with deposition transcripts from one of Karen's allies who, under pressure, admitted they had received instructions to pressure Clay through procedural means. Finally, Amanda called Clay to the stand. He spoke with calm simplicity, explained his work, his intent, and described the months of silent attacks, the letters, the tampering, the false reports. He didn't dramatize. He didn't accuse. He just told the truth, measured, clean, undeniable. The courtroom fell silent when Amanda asked the judge to examine the location of Karen's claimed injury point, whether it was on her own property or within Clay's. The judge studied the map. She looked at the photos. And then she looked at Karen. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "did you knowingly enter Mr. Bennett's property in order to photograph his sculpture?" Karen hesitated. She didn't answer. The judge repeated the question. "I believe I stood near the edge," Karen finally said. "The glare can be seen from—" The judge cut her off. "That's not what I asked." The silence was heavier this time. After a 10-minute recess, the judge returned with her ruling. The lawsuit was dismissed in full. Karen's claim of injury was deemed unsubstantiated due to lack of medical evidence, conflicting testimony, and confirmed trespass. Clay's sculpture was declared compliant with all local ordinances and was reaffirmed as protected under freedom of artistic expression and property rights. But more than that, the judge issued a formal admonishment against Karen for abuse of legal process and referred the matter to a civil oversight committee for further review. While no fines were imposed immediately, the referral itself was a scar, a public one. Karen sat frozen, her posture still but her hands trembling in her lap. Her allies slowly filtered out behind her, avoiding each other's eyes, not saying a word. Amanda packed her documents methodically, not triumphant, just satisfied with justice served. Clay stood for a moment longer, absorbing the stillness that had replaced months of pressure. When he stepped outside, the air felt cleaner, the light more ordinary, no longer weaponized or distorted by fear. But the fight hadn't just ended with vindication. It had reshaped everything. The sculpture, once just a reflection of form, had become a monument to principle, something built not just with steel, but with every minute of defiance, every recorded insult, every unwanted spotlight turned into a shield. Clay understood now, deeply, that art wasn't about beauty. It was about confrontation, about daring someone to look, and about enduring the weight of being seen. And he had done just that. Not with force, not with vengeance, but with immovable resolve. Amanda shook his hand outside the courtroom and said, "You didn't just win, Clay. You made them admit they lost." He didn't reply. He didn't need to. He walked back to his truck, turned the key, and drove home. Not to celebrate, not to rest, but to weld. Because the work never stopped. Because the fire that shaped steel was the same fire that had kept him standing. The weeks that followed the courtroom decision felt strangely quiet, as if the neighborhood itself had taken a breath it didn't realize it had been holding. The sculpture stood exactly where it always had, unmoved and unbothered. But the tension that had once clung to it like a second skin had dissipated. No more anonymous letters appeared in Clay's mailbox. No more footsteps at night. No more unsolicited glances over the fence charged with suspicion. Even the silence felt different now. Not the silence of waiting, but of release. Clay didn't celebrate. There was no need. Victory had never been the goal. It was survival, the right to create without fear, to exist without permission, to be left alone in the place he built with his own hands. Amanda closed out the case with clinical efficiency, submitting her final invoices, collecting documentation, and filing the last of the protection measures to ensure nothing would surface again under a different name. Clay met her one final time in her office, shook her hand, and thanked her not for winning, but for staying. She smiled and said he was the most prepared client she had ever worked with, and that she hoped she'd never have to represent him again, because that would mean he was finally allowed to live in peace. He nodded once and walked out, not with relief, but with resolve. He understood now that some wars end with a bang, and some with the absence of noise. This was the latter, and that was just fine. Back at his property, the signs of conflict still lingered, not physically but in subtle reminders. The gate had been reinforced. The sensor system he installed remained active. The mailbox was new. But more importantly, the sculpture had changed. After the trial, Clay made several small but deliberate modifications. He polished out the corrosive marks that hadn't been deep enough to leave permanent damage, and he welded a new plate to its base. One not visible from the street, but perfectly readable if you stood beside it. Proven under pressure. It wasn't a boast. It was a record. The sculpture hadn't become a symbol by design. It had been forced into it, like steel reshaped by heat, not for art's sake, but for survival's. Karen was seen less and less. The church group she once led dissolved quietly. Her position in the community, once fortified by repetition and routine, became untenable. Some neighbors still nodded politely, but no one followed any more. At the next community meeting, she sat at the far end of the room, silent, while someone else read the agenda. No one mentioned her name, and when the discussion turned to prior zoning conflicts, it was only as a learning moment, not a grievance. Clay didn't attend. He never had. He didn't need recognition or apologies. What mattered was that her authority had evaporated, not because someone shouted louder, but because someone refused to be silent. One evening, as summer gave way to fall and the angle of the sun no longer cut sharp shadows across the sculpture, Clay stood beside it and listened to the wind slipping through the metal. It sounded different now, less like tension, more like breath. He wasn't the same man who had built it. The fight had aged him, sharpened him, stripped away any illusion that logic alone could stand against fear. But it hadn't broken him. If anything, it had clarified something he'd suspected for years but never voiced aloud, that people like Karen didn't just hate noise or light or change, they hated independence that didn't ask for validation. He didn't rebuild the community, didn't throw open his gates, didn't turn the backyard into a public gallery. He kept it all exactly as it was. Private, hard-edged, unapologetically intact. He accepted a few commissions from collectors who had followed the case and admired the piece not just as sculpture, but as a monument. But he didn't change his process, his rhythm, or his boundaries. He welded in the morning, walked the perimeter at night, and poured his focus into materials that didn't lie or flinch. And with every new arc, every fusion of metal, he reminded himself that the fight had never been about Karen. Not really. It had always been about how far someone would go to silence what made them uncomfortable, and how far he was willing to go to defend his right to create in spite of it. And so the story ended not with destruction or redemption, but with something rarer, continuation. Clay kept building. The steel kept standing. And the silence that returned was no longer a threat. It was earned.